Is November 15th, Friday, of course, at 5:30-ish in the morning. Webinar number 91. It's Uncle Pete's Corner. And what were you saying, Wolfgang, about these webinars?
Oh boy, I can say a lot of things about it. No, I just love it. It's great fun to be always having guys around, having a chat. And I tell you what, it doesn't matter how complicated or how simple the project or demo is being put on, there's always a little tidbits coming out. I think even Pete will even attest to that fact that like last week somebody came with another way of was a tilde equal sign, which is a great little tidbit which I've been using, and I wanted to say something about it, but unfortunately I was like between divided attention at that point in time, so I didn't want to stop the chat, but later down the line. But I think both ways we all learn, and it's great stuff. And if you're not live with it, you can't put your 5 cents worth in between, which might just add big value to both parties. It's not just about the presenter; it's also presenter getting something back again of it. And I think that's the idea what I've also tried to do in our presentations, because we learn so much from other people also. That's
Yeah,
great
I,
stuff.
I fully agree. That's in fact, you will see if you read the blog article that goes with this. I end with the fact that one of the
Yeah,
reasons that I suggest people do these things is,
yeah,
every time I do one, the resulting code, I find 4 or 5 things that I clean up,
yeah,
and this one is no exception. This little variable column with looper, the what I'm presenting today is much simpler than the preview I showed you last week, because I found a few other pieces of it that I could clean up and not use.
mm,
We don't do code reviews like we were taught in school,
mm,
and this preparing for a presentation forces you to do that code review, and you
yeah,
start finding out that maybe there was something to those code reviews after all.
yeah. And also, when I'm giving a presentation on a topic, you have to start framing it also properly and get it all straight in your mind. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to make sense to anybody else. But in the
Right.
process of doing that, you yourself pick up so much from that yourself, because you kind of solidify whatever you've learned, and it makes it stick for a longer period in your brain. And 2 years down the line, you'll still kind of remember that because you learn so much more about it.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
like you said, one of the reasons that I really want people to participate live is that interaction back and forth is helps both parties. Like your little comment last week, cleaned up my code considerably.
mm-mm. Yeah.
If
It's not
we
just my
program in a
comment;
bubble,
it's
we
everybody.
we we never improve.
Yeah, yeah. And it's a problem. I think a lot of us work in a bubble in a sense. You maybe a team of one or two, and you kind of get stuck in the way you do things. And it's maybe because of legacy systems, I call it. You've done it that way, and you come to a new system, and you kind of try implement what you've learned back then now, and then you find out, hey, there's a lot easier stuff. I would like to do a presentation which you've started with, that open source thing, how to make that section a little bit easier. But yeah, that's another story. But which I've picked up on along the way while messing around with WinDev. So yeah, I'm quite happy to do presentations, because it really gets you thinking, and you end up exploring stuff which you wouldn't have done. Um, yeah, and I think just myself, going back to some of the webinars, it becomes a great archive of stuff which you just can go back again, because you might not use this loop of what you've done today, um, Um, 6 months down the line, you might get a project which does, and then you're like, oh, I remember that, and you can go back and check it.
Exactly.
And that shortens that hour you spend maybe again looking it over, shortens that development cycle chronically.
Yeah. Well, the questions that were asked on Skype this week, I know at least 5 or 6 different times my answer was that was shown in a webinar.
Yeah. Yeah. Perfect. Okay.
Well, doesn't that say it, huh?
Exactly.
So, do you want to get going? We got Glenn,
Yep.
the professor,
I'm
here
ready.
already, and 3 of the other guys. And
Glenn has crawled off from under the rock that he's been hiding under.
Yes, I have.
That rock is called courthouse system or something along those lines.
That's true.
Morning all. Welcome.
So, you ready to get started?
I'm ready.
We got Daniel here now. Okay.
Okay. We're already recording, so I guess we'll just jump right into it. You're already seeing my screen, correct?
Yeah, we are. We see heading there. And did you see my Skype? I'll say maybe the live event is free and the recordings will charge for.
Like I said, I definitely would recommend that you don't kill yourself to get the recording up there immediately afterwards.
Yeah, maybe penalize people for not showing.
Yeah.
Reward the people that come.
That's right. Positive reinforcement.
That's it.
All right. Well, let's do a quick refresher of where we left off. Oh. Okay. This one's going to be upset with me, apparently. Let's do it this way if it'll work. There we go. Okay, this was our type ahead entry.
Hey, did you have all those minus things last time?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's so that you can delete an entry.
Remove it, yeah.
Yeah, I haven't actually done the code behind that yet, but that's, it's a simple button, so the code for that is pretty straightforward.
It was there, Arnold.
All right, so what we're going to cover today is this bottom section, the little yellow boxes, which is actually a looper with a variable number of columns and variable width to those columns. As you see, we've got 5 entries in the first row, 3 entries in the second row, and the widths are all over the map. So that's the piece of this we're going to accomplish today. If you missed last week and that whole type ahead thing that you saw me doing as I went through that, we covered that last week, and Arnold's already got that recording up, and I've posted a blog article that goes along with it. So be sure to check that out if you missed last week. So let's talk about getting that looper to work. So what I'm going to do is basically we're going to build this thing up a piece at a time. So what I've done to get us started is started out pretty much where I started out with this looper. I wanted to have the variable column width, so silly me, I said, well, I'll bet if I just come in here and turn on variable number of columns, everything will just work. one checkbox, I'll be done. Turned out it wasn't quite that simple. So what I started with was my looper, which that's what we've got selected now. Inside that looper, I've got a cell. That's what produces the little yellow box. Inside that cell is a static that represents the name, and then the delete button that Arnold was just talking about. So that's the makeup of everything. The cell, the static, and the looper are all set. The anchoring are set to adapt the content. So, and notice that my looper is a little taller than the box. The reason why is I want a little space between the rows, obviously. And I also have a little space behind my looper is wider than the box so that I get some spacing between the boxes. So again, I truly thought that I was going to be done at this point. But when we run this thing, find my screen where I got those so that we get the same ones. Obviously, we're not getting the effect we want. The boxes, let me get one of the longer ones in here so you can really see. We are getting variable width. As you see, this one is wider than these, but we are stretching everything out to a certain width, and we're also only getting 2 columns showing up here, and we don't have spaces between the boxes. So not exactly the effect we were going for. So the next thing I addressed was that space between the boxes. And for that, we're going to use the magic of television, as Julia Childs taught us. And we're going to put a static in. And all I did was, this is a static. It has no caption, so nothing's going to be displayed. All I'm using, this goes back to the old days of HTML. Those of us that have been around doing HTML since the dark ages always had to use transparent GIFs to do spacing and different tricks to get things spaced around. So this is the WebDev modern version of that. I'm sticking a static in here, and the only reason I'm doing that is now there's something reserving that space between the end of the yellow box and the looper. So even if my yellow box expands in width, I'm still going to get that little bit of spacing between it and the next box, so that I don't have that problem of the boxes butting up against each other, because now there's that little static in between. So now if we run it,
So Pete, just by putting that spacer in, it resized it to only what it needed, or did you do something to do that?
yeah, no, that's That's another one of those little tricks of the way browsers behave, that having that extra little space in there kind of forced the sizing
Isn't that
issue
something? Yeah.
to reduce down.
Hmm.
So now, we've got our little space between the boxes. We're much closer, but notice we're not using the full space here. And this one is the one that I really struggled with, and I mean, I tried a bunch of different things. And the answer to it becomes quite simple once we understand what's going on. And what I'm going to do now is kind of take you into the dark magic side of developing WebDev. When this goes back to the whole foundational thing of, if you don't understand what's going on behind the covers, you're going to be at the mercy of WebDev. And WebDev's a great product, but there are times where it does stuff that we don't want it to do. And if we don't understand the underlying HTML and CSS stuff, we're going to be at its mercy. So I use Chrome as my browser, and Chrome has these great add-ons called the developer tools. And one of the things it does is let me right-click right here and do inspect element. And as you see, as I move my mouse around, it's highlighting whatever is contained in that code. So this table row contains my entire looper. And notice the width of that thing. It's the same width as the to field. If we scroll up a little further here, we'll find out that there's our culprit. This div section right here contains all of our entry fields, and notice the width that's defined. Now, nothing in my design page in the IDE, there's no cell, there's nothing saying that I need a container that wide. There's nothing there. But as you see, WebDev has defined one, quote unquote, for me. And this is that magic that WebDev's doing of translating our IDE design into HTML and CSS. Unfortunately, it doesn't always get it the way we want. And the reason why is it all comes down to that variable looper setting. Notice when we click on this looper, we only see that one field. Now, if this looper were set to 3 columns, notice how you see all 3 columns. Or, actually, let's make it 4. Notice it shows you the representation of those 4 columns. When we make it variable width or variable columns, it doesn't do that for the simple fact it doesn't know how many columns it's going to be. The issue is when WebDev's logic is going through and deciding how to define all those dev sections, it doesn't see those extra columns out here, so it doesn't reserve space for them. And that's why our looper is only using up this amount of space, because it's wrapped with a dev that is only using that amount of space. Again, we can see that looking at the HTML code. So the question is, how do we resolve that? Well, now that we understand what's going on, the solution is fairly obvious. If we put a cell around that looper, that's the entire width of our page here, then it's going to force that outer dev to contain that, and we're going to be able to use up all of our space. So I will go grab the cell that I declared over here, put it here, delete the looper out. Okay, so there's our cell. We move it up. And right now, you notice this is in pink. That's because the cell is sitting on top of the looper. But if we come into the cell and we add the looper to the cell, now the cell's inside the looper, and it doesn't show in pink because it's now contained inside that looper. Nothing else magic about this.
What about your spacer? Do you have to bring that up too?
What spacer?
The one after the static, or does that static have the spacer?
That's contained. That spacer is contained inside the looper.
Oh, the looper in the cell. Oh, the whole looper in the cell. Okay.
Yeah, the entire. We put the entire looper inside the cell.
Okay.
And everything else is contained inside that looper. And then the cell is defined without any border or background, so it's simply a container. It's not going to be visual on the screen. And now if we run the page, now we get the desired effect because we're using the entire width. And if we do the inspect element again, we will see that container div now is defined wider because it had to define itself wide enough to contain that cell that we declared. So even though this div, there's nothing in the ID defining that div, the controls on the screen are what's determining how that div is defined. So by adjusting what controls and how they're positioned on the screen, it's affecting the underlying HTML code and getting us the desired effect. So
the big takeaway is these web tools, whether it's Firebird or this element inspect.
Exactly. I'm sure they all, other than IE, have tools similar to this.
Wow, nice.
that one having the tools, and two understanding what this HTML and CSS code is. I would encourage anyone that's doing web dev development to go back to the dark ages, open up something like Coffee Editor or something and create an HTML page from scratch, and at least have a basic understanding of HTML and CSS, because it's going to pay huge dividends understanding the whys and hows of what WebDev does. It also helps you understand what the limitations are, and the fact that a lot of those limitations aren't WebDev limitations, they're web limitations. Now, one other point I'd like to make, and this goes back, Arnold, we were having this discussion with Wolfgang earlier, why I encourage everyone to do these webinars and so forth, is because just by doing a presentation, it forces you into a code review and makes you review your work. And almost every time I do that, I improve my code. And this was no exception. In fact, those of you that watched last week's webinar probably saw that, at the end I did a little preview of what this week was going to be, and it was far more complicated. But as I went through it and prepared for this week, I found I was able to simplify it considerably. And let's take a look at that. This cell is called cell reminder address, and it contains the looper is the only thing in it. And then the looper has the cell, that's our yellow box, the attribute, it has that one space, and then that yellow box has the button and the static. So that's all that's contained in there. Now let's go look at the original version. Cell reminder address. There's the looper. There's the yellow box, the attribute, that space. But when we look inside here, look at all these extra spacings and stuff. The reason why is, as I was working on this, trying to make it work, to get that dynamic spacing to work of the name, I thought that I was going to have to use relative spacing of the cell. And once you turn on relative positioning of the controls, it smashes all your controls right against each other inside the cell. So I had to use several other space blocks to force things to have some spacing. But as I was preparing for this presentation and stripping it down to the simplest example, I found out that that spacing was working fine without all of that extra magic. And by turning off that relative cell spacing, I could get rid of all those extra spaces and much simplified the design. That's much easier. There's only one space static versus this one's got 3 additional ones beyond that one that's down here. So that's again a good reason to kind of force yourself to do these presentations. And anyone that's done them, I'm sure, will agree with me that you get as much out of it as you give, definitely. So that's
Fantastic.
that's that's how you get variable column widths and variable number of columns in a looper. It's an amazing feature that if you put your mind to it, I'm sure there's a lot of places where you can use that inside your web designs. Any questions on what we did before we move on to Bob's presentation?
That's pretty slick. You really simplified how to look at it, Go ahead, Wolfgang.
Yep, I was going to. Practically, that's the same thing I wanted to say. You made a complicated method look simple.
Yeah, I'm really pleased with the results. I mean,
it makes you aware. Yeah, but the takeaway is just also, instead of just for this instance of yours, we might find it somewhere else we was doing it, because I'm just thinking I'm going to go back to look at the screen of mine, which I had a problem with it scrunching up not the right way I wanted it. And I did look at it, but I didn't look at it the way that you did it. And I kind of, you know about it, but the HTML underlaying. In the old days, I remember using front page and all those things, doing all the funny things. It was a gift, a blank gift, a transparent gift. And it worked very well, but you kind of, you get into this mindset of, oh, this is 5GL, it'll do it all for you kind of thing, and you forget about the basics again. Yeah. And
Yeah,
here we go, and I'm thinking
the
I must
thing
go
to
back there. I'm nearly
the
sure that's the issue.
yeah the thing to remember is, you know, we kind of get spoiled working in web dev, and we think, you know, it's like WinDev and we're
I'm
writing a
kidding.
program, but at the end of the day, web dev cannot do anything that doesn't get translated to HTML, CSS,
Yeah,
and JavaScript. That is not a limitation of web dev.
100%.
That's a limitation of the browser environment. So, you know, there is no magic. You know, there's a lot of magic in what they're doing to keep us from having to mess with all that underlying
Yeah.
code. But they can't create a new browser feature.
Mm.
They have to live in the rules of the browser, which are
Yeah.
HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. If it can't be done with those three, it can't be done in web
Yeah.
dev. So
Yeah.
understanding, at least at the fundamental level, those three technologies makes your life much simpler when you start doing web dev development. Have I
Yeah.
firmly climbed on
I
that
agree with you.
soapbox?
I remember the days when. No, I agree with you. I remember the days when we played around with front page and other tools similar to that. You kind of laid out those little boxes and lines and everything else, and the tables and the columns, and you knocked your head 6 to a dozen to make it all work. And now WebDev makes it so much easier, but then you fall into the trap, like you say, of the 5th GL. You expect to do it all, and you keep forgetting it. It's got nothing to do with WebDev sometimes. It's the underlying translation. And if you don't explicitly say, hey, keep it that width, or whatever the case is, it's very similar going back to the plain HTML in those back days. It's going to do exactly that. And you have to be aware of it. I think you've hit it on the nail. It's very important to remember when you mess around with WebDev.
Yeah, I think something else important.
What I love about it.
Go ahead, Wolfgang.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to show, as you see this code, when I'm looking at it in the developer tool, looks pretty nice and pretty easy to read. Everything's tabbed. That is not the HTML code as it's coming across to the browser. The Chrome tool has cleaned up the code and made it readable for me. If we come up here and do view page source, that's the actual HTML code. So that's quite a bit more challenging to read. So you know, that's another reason that tool. Yeah. And when I first started messing around, I was looking at this going, how do I figure anything out? But you know, the developer tool really help.
That's what that's a thing. I again use Firebug extension for the Firefox. It's similar to this one, but in both cases I mess around. First was I use developers with Firefox, but in the result you have to go and have a look at how it looks like in Outlook, and you have to have a look at how it looks like in Chrome, etc. Because it does have each unfortunately each browser has got its nuances and its petty way of rendering stuff. I call it petty way of rendering stuff because Internet Explorer tends to be the one you used to be the odd one out in this lot. And many times, I don't know if you found that.
Yeah,
but,
yeah, definitely.
But usually when you make it work for Internet Explorer, the others just work, which is quite nice. But the point is, you still have to go and look at this, and WinDev surprises me very well how it renders everything so nicely for you. I remember the first times we used to use tools, and it was like you spend days and just laying it out and getting it right, just right. Here we drag it around and slice and dice and carry on as if it's nothing. And you can put a decent website together quite quickly, a web page quite quickly compared in the old days. But the rules still apply, and I think you might think you're on a soapbox, but I'm going to stress it again on from my side. Remember that you have to think in those terms, because that is still there. It's not gone away just because WinDev is doing it for you.
Absolutely.
I hope that makes sense.
Alrighty.
And I don't think you can stress it enough.
Yeah,
Fantastic.
I think that you know, the reason that I have adopted so well to WebDev is because I did a couple years of code fusion development, where a lot of the guys, especially on the Skype US group, came from Clarion and Windows development, and the first web development they tried was in WebDev, and they've never had to get down into the guts, and I think having worked in the guts has gave me that advantage of knowing a little more of what's going on behind the scenes. And like I said, it sometimes we just have to invest in ourselves, and one of the ways to do that is to spend a little time. You don't have to learn JavaScript and be able to write massive JavaScript code or anything like that. But pick up a JavaScript for Dummies book, an HTML for Dummies, a CSS for Dummies book, and at least know them at that level.
Yeah, good tip. Yeah, good tip.
Or call Arnold, because Arnold knows all of it.
Once again. Yeah.
How was I supposed to respond to that?
Just making sure you're still awake.
Don't be so modest.
I'm here. So should we anything?
Yeah,
any questions?
Unless we have any questions on this, I believe we're ready to hand the reins over to Bob.
Okay. I don't see any other questions, so I'm going to stop the recording and do that. Okay. So thank you again, Pete and Wolfgang, for chiming in. We'll see you in a minute.